If you watch this channel, then you probably know that my favorite analog FPV camera has been the Runcam Eagle. So I liked it so much that I made a custom version of the Runcam Eagle with a few tweaked settings to my specifications. Called it the JB Micro Eagle. But the Micro Eagle is coming to an end. In fact, it's been discontinued and it's probably out of stock everywhere you look. If you love the JB Micro Eagle, buy it because they're not making them anymore. And that means that I need to pick my new favorite camera. And that's what you're looking at right now. This is the, careful there, Joshua. This is the Runcam Phoenix V2 JB Edition. And what we got going on here is the Runcam Phoenix, which I feel captures some of the characteristics that I really look for in an FPV analog camera, but with a few settings that I have tweaked to my own specifications. And one brand new feature that is not available on the non-JB Phoenix that I'm going to tell you about a little later in the video. And yes, I am going to tell you about my settings and show you how I reach them. So if you want to duplicate them at home or just figure out how I tune an FPV camera, you can follow along. See, it's just like every JB video. There's a little product announcement and some education. I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something. Can I hit it? Can he hit it? Can he hit it? Yes, see, it's a gap. Yes. Before I show you the tweaks that I made to the default settings of the Runcam Phoenix V2, and before I reveal what the new feature that is being added to my version of the camera is, I just want to talk to you for a minute about what I look for in a camera image. And the number one thing I look for is dynamic range. That is the ability to have both bright and dark things in the image at the same time without losing detail in either of them. And that's why I'm showing you this image of me flying at the end of the day, because there's lots of long shadows being cast across the property. And with certain cameras, you would have a very contrasty image, and those shadows would be dark or the highlights would be bright white and blown out. But with a really good CMOS camera tuned just right, then you can get a lot of detail in both the highlights and the shadows. And that's a good thing because you need to be able to see where you're going. Even in a shot like that one that you just saw with the sun right in your face, you can still get a lot of detail. Obviously the sun is going to blow out a little bit, but the whole image doesn't blow out. It's pretty freaking good. Here I'm going to fly back this direction, kind of looking into the sun, and show you what I'm talking about as I go under this gap. You can see that there's still a lot of detail preserved throughout the image, even as the sun is in the screen and where it might be blowing it out otherwise. Now this is the image as it's configured as delivered by Runcam, and I want to walk you through the changes that I made and why I think those changes make the image better. I got to acknowledge right off the bat, this is a better looking image if you are watching the video, but I don't think it's a better image if you are actually flying the quad. So your first reaction to this may be, oh, it's nice and contrasty. Joshua's settings look kind of washed out. But hang on. The first thing I want you to see is that there is some of that digital shimmer in the image, especially if you look at the fence, the long straight lines of the fence on my property. In just a second, you're going to see some like diagonal striping, moire, alias, I don't know what you want to call it. It's a little over sharpened, and I've definitely turned down the sharpening a little bit to get rid of some of that. The other thing you notice is that it is a lot more contrasty. My image looks kind of washed out by comparison, but like I said, I think being able to actually see those details in the shadows, to be able to see deep in shadow sooner, actually benefits you as a pilot as opposed to a spectator. And let's face it, the DVR is for the pilot, really not so much for the spectator. Now, if you already have a Runcam Phoenix 2 and you want to copy my settings, here are the full settings of my camera's menu. You can just go through and you can set them to match. In a minute, I'm going to show you the process of how I arrived at these settings. So maybe if you want to tweak them, you get a little insight into at least my thought process. But here are the settings if you want to follow along. The first thing I do when I'm tuning an FPV camera is I mess with the brightness. That is the major control that affects how the image looks. And in this case, you can see that as I turn the brightness up, that highlight in the middle of the porch starts to trend towards white and get blown out. Also, the sky here above the barn starts to lose detail. And I want to set that brightness to the point where I'm not losing meaningful highlight detail, but I'm also not got it so low that I'm losing detail in the shadows. So here I've turned it all the way down to 9, and in the shadow areas, I can just barely see details, and I'm not losing any highlight detail, but maybe as I turn it up, the shadows gain a little more detail, and maybe the lost highlight detail in the sky I don't quite care about so much. As far as white balance goes, I've seen some other pilots who tune their cameras use manual white balance, and I just don't see the sense of it. You're not going to be in the same lighting conditions, so you should always have auto white balance. Now I'm turning the contrast up and down, and as the contrast goes down, there's a point where you get increased dynamic range and increased detail, but then there's a point where it just gets washed out and meaningless. As well, there's a point where you turn it up and the picture gets super contrasty, but you lose detail. So I'm looking especially at the shadows. It feels to me like contrast primarily affects shadows, whereas brightness primarily affects highlights. I'm looking at that shadow detail and trying to find the sweet spot where we have enough detail without being too washed out and just kind of looking crappy. Next, we adjust sharpness, and I'm always going to set manual sharpness on any of these CMOS cameras because I think most of them are over sharpened from the factory. As I turn the sharpness down, I'm looking at the detail in the branches in the distance and in the bushes up close. Setting the sharpness at 0 is a little bit over soft. I basically want to find the lowest value that gets the highest value that gets rid of the shimmer. Here's a great demonstration of what sharpness does to the image. There are so many straight lines in here. You can really see the effect on the image as sharpness goes up. You get a little bit of haloing and a little bit of shimmering, whereas when you bring it down, the image gets softer. Next, I adjust the color gain, and if you turn this all the way down, you just get a black and white image, which of course nobody really wants. On the other hand, if you turn it up, you get a hyper-saturated image, but you also lose some of the details that you worked so hard to get back by adjusting the brightness and contrast. So I want this color gain as high as it can be just because a more saturated image looks pleasant, but I don't want it so high that I'm losing any details. I always want to be able to see the stuff coming at me. So I think you're going to see that I settle on actually a slightly lower than default value. I think it defaults to 10 out of the box, and here you're going to see me trying a slightly lower value than that, which it doesn't look as nice to your eye when you're spectating, but I think it's more useful when you're flying to be able to see details in shadows, and just every part of the image should have details that help you see what's coming at you. Now this camera has one other feature that I really wanted Runcam to add, and thankfully they were able to do it, and it makes this camera unique compared to the other Runcam Phoenix V2. If you look at the Runcam Phoenix V2, you see it has standard ground and menu plug for this kind of joystick, and you're going to use this joystick to change the camera settings, the brightness, contrast, and etc. But I really like the ability to change those settings in the field using my controller. Now Betaflight has the analog camera control joystick emulation feature. If your flight controller has a cam_C pad, that you hook it up to the joystick pin on your camera, and to tell you the truth, most of the time it doesn't work. It's just very difficult to get that working reliably. If you have had it work reliably for you in every case, you're one of the lucky ones. So Runcam invented a digital camera control interface, and this camera has that. You can tell because it says G/TX and M/RX, and the camera can hook to the UART on your flight controller, and then you control it the same way as you would with the analog interface. It just works 100% of the time instead of like maybe 50% of the time. So let me show you a little bit more about that. I'm going to go ahead and plug this camera in, and what I want you to see is that in the upper left corner of the screen it says UART control, and that means that it is ready to be controlled by your flight controller. And I elected to ship it that way because I think most people using this are going to use UART control instead of the joystick. If you do want to use the joystick, what you're going to need is one of these. This is a joystick plug that I have twisted together the ground and the menu wires, when then power up the camera with them shorted together. There's various ways you could do that, but I just have one of these spare camera plugs that I cut off. And then you would power the camera up with the ground and the joystick pins shorted. And when you do that, it'll say Joystick Control in the upper left of the screen instead of UART Control. Well, folks, as long as we're here, I'm going to show you the rest of the steps that are necessary to getting camera control working with this camera. You're going to wire the TX and the RX wire from this pin header to any spare UART on your flight controller. TX on the camera goes to RX on the flight controller. RX on the camera goes to TX on the flight controller. Then you're going to go to your Betaflight Ports tab, and in the Ports tab, for the UART that you used, you're going to enable the Runcam peripheral. And that's all you got to do. Then I'm going to plug my quad in. Now, my video transmitter is not on yet, and the reason for that is that I've used the Tiny Sleds Real Pit board to allow me to switch my video transmitter on and off with a switch on my transmitter. What? If you want to know how to do that, there's a link in the video description to the video showing you how I set that up. So cool. Then, to enter camera control mode, you're going to center your throttle and you're going to yaw right. You're going to hear a beep like that if you have a beeper, and you're going to see remote mode on top of the screen. That means you're now in remote mode. Then, the pitch and roll axis are the up and down on the little joystick. See the thing here? Up, down, left, right. Up, down, left, right. And then how do you click the center button? You yaw right. So in order to open the menu, I'm going to yaw right, and here we are. And I can just move through this menu just like it was a regular camera. I'm going to exit out of that and cancel. So that brings us to the end of the video, and as always, the question, should you buy it? And just because this is like my product, I'm not kidding myself that every single person out there is going to look at this and go, this is the image I want from my analog camera. Analog cameras are highly subjective, and either you're looking at this and you're going, yes, I agree, this is great, I want this, in which case there's links in the video description and you can go pick it up from one of the vendors selling the camera. I gotta tell you, even if there was another camera out there, maybe whose image I liked a little better, and I'm not saying that there is, the availability of the Runcam camera control is so awesome to just have that work 100% of the time, and to be able to tweak the camera just a little bit in the field very, very easily. Once you get used to that feature, I don't know, I kind of find it hard to live without, and it's one of the reasons I kind of stick with Runcam cameras for my personal builds, even though I test other cameras for test and review purposes. Which brings us to the end of the video. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks for Runcam for working with me to make this camera exactly how I want it. And thanks to you if you decide that it's the camera for you and you decide to buy it. Happy flying, everybody. Do you see this baby? Isn't he cute? Hit the subscribe button. Join my Patreon. Use my affiliate links. Or just keep watching videos. That's better than nothing. Go, go, gaga, subscribe to my daddy.